how lucky we were to get to know Jim Bailey. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
I knew Jim for 55 years. 27 of those at the Arkansas Gazette, where we worked side by side. We ate a lot of meals at the Minuteman, at Frankie's Cafeteria every Sunday night, and certainly at Cuz Fisher's late night meals during the week. Jim, yes, he was a colleague. He was my mentor. But most of all, he was my friend. And he was my friend until the very end. Jim taught me how to write. He taught me to be a reporter. He taught me about the newspaper business. But most of all, he taught me about life. I still use a lot of those things today that Jim taught me many, many years ago. And I can honestly say that I learned more from listening to Jim than I probably did with all of my school teachers. He would have made a great teacher, wouldn't he, Don? But there have been some wonderful stories this week about Jim, and there's so many that you just don't know where to start or where to end on stories from Jim. But Jim hadn't written a lot. It's been a while since Jim wrote his last column, but I just want to read just a brief excerpt from the book, The Razorbacks, that Jim wrote, just to show you how talented this guy was that we're honoring today. Listen. It happened to be October 5th, 1957, a football night in War Memorial Stadium, but it could have been any such evening during the last 2 decades. High in the west stands, one spectator and his wife were annoyed by a juiced-up, loud, offensive patron in a seat behind them. The man in front finally let himself be distracted from the field long enough to say the drunk's remarks should not be made in mixed company. So the drunk pulled out a knife and slashed at the neck and throat of the man in front. They took 4 stitches, and he grudgingly let him go back to his seat. He agreed to check in for more treatment at the hospital after the game. Now here comes the real Jim Bailey. The drunk was removed, of course, and police officers came back after the game to obtain a statement from the fan who was slashed. Arkansas beat TCU 20-7, and the fan was so pleased with the game he refused to press charges. When the story came out, people were shocked by the attack, but not least surprised by the victim's reaction. And then Jim added this nugget. You know, conference opener and all. That was Jim Bailey. Jim, like I said, we were all amazed at how well he could write. We always asked the question, Harry, why was it so easy for Jim and so hard for the rest of us? I never could figure that out, but he made it look so easy in everything he did. I admired Jim so much that I was single back in many years ago, and I would take a week of my vacation to drive Jim to St. Petersburg, Florida for the Cardinals spring training. You can imagine over 1,000 miles how many stories Jim told. And it was endless. He only asked me one favor when we were on our way. He said, you got to get me to Hattiesburg, Mississippi in time for supper. He had a favorite restaurant there that he really liked. But whether we were driving to St. Petersburg, Florida, or whether we were driving to Arkadelphia or to Conway or to Magnolia, going with Jim was not a trip, it was an experience. And he would just keep you in stitches the entire time you were there, and then listening to him interview the coaches and all, it was something to behold. I've got a couple of stories that I want to talk about just because I was there and I saw it, and it was so typical Jim Bailey. Jim loved boxing, but he loved baseball. He loved the Travelers, but he also loved the St. Louis Cardinals. And every chance he got to cover the Cardinals was a great day for Jim. And thankfully, in his last days at the Gazette, he was able to cover the Travelers an entire season, and he said that was one of the greatest things that ever happened. But this was much earlier. There was the manager of the St. Louis Cardinals was a guy named Vern Ralph. Vern Ralph had been the manager of the Arkansas Travelers, and of course Jim got to know him very well. So one day Jim told me, he said, you want to go to St. Louis for a baseball game? I said, sure. So we drove there, We got there, and the Cardinals were having a bad year. And Vernon Rapp was getting a lot of media attention, bad media attention, from the St. Louis press and from a lot of the Missouri press. So sure enough, they lost the game. Jim and I made our way down from the press box down to the clubhouse. When we got there, we had all of these sports writers, sportscasters from St. Louis waiting to get into the dressing room. And finally, after about 10 minutes, Vernon Rapp opened the door. He just barely opened the door to the clubhouse. He looked out and he saw Jim. And he said, "Come on in, Jim." And so Jim and I walked in, and he immediately shut the door. Jim went in. They must have chatted for 10 or 15 minutes. And then finally, Vern told one of his coaches, said, "Now, go unlock the door and let the rest of these guys in here." You should have seen the faces of these guys, because they were saying, "Who in the world is this guy?" And what? Well, that just goes to show you the respect that Jim Bailey had, not just here in Arkansas, but anywhere he went in the media. You could tell people that you worked for the Arkansas Gazette, and they said, "Do you know Jim Bailey?" It was tremendous. The other time, though, that Jim also, he had another side to him. He could communicate a point to his readers, and here was a perfect one. There was a new AIC commissioner in town, and he decided that he wanted to have an all-star football game at War Memorial Stadium in December. Jim didn't like the idea, and he wrote a column about it, and he explained that, it's why would the AIC champion want to play a bunch of all-stars? Why would you want to do it when the schools are shut down for Christmas? And thirdly, why in December? It's cold. Anyway, the AIC commissioner said, "No, we're going to play it." And they did. So the morning of the game, I picked Jim up at his house. It was cold, gray day. As we drove to War Memorial, a little sleet started hitting the stands. It started hitting the windshield. By the time we got to the press box, the sleet was coming down pretty heavy. And by the time the game started, it was sleeting badly. We looked down, and there might have been 300 people in the stands, maybe. But we covered the game. Jim covered the game. And we got back, drove back to the office. And I saw Jim sitting there at the typewriter, and I was working on my story. But I knew that it was Jim, the wheels were turning. And because he would light one cigarette after the other. This was about a 3-cigarette deal here. And finally, after about 10 minutes, he called me over to look at the lead. And I don't have Jim's memory. I don't know exactly what the whole lead said, but I do remember this. This is how it started. On a day when War Memorial Stadium never looked more spacious. That was Jim. There's so many things. If you look back there, as Sports Writer of the Year for 18 years, and was voted Sports Writer of the Year 18 years, and as Harry King put it so greatly, it should have been unanimous every year. But anyway, we all cherished Jim. Only a few weeks ago, Peggy asked me if I would sit with Jim for a couple of hours. She had some things to do, and I said, sure. And of course, Jim couldn't speak, but I sat there in the chair, and he kind of indicated maybe he was tossing a little bit, so I got him some water, and I held his hand, and I just told him how much I really loved him. So on my way to the car, I thought, if you could turn the clock back, what would have been his last column? What would have been his last story he would have told us? I don't know what it would have been. I know one thing. I would have read the column and I would have listened to the story. That's how much I thought of Jim Bailey. So, as we honor him today, all I've got left to say is, Jim, I love you. I miss you.